Cody, Wyoming. March 1961. There is a cold in Wyoming in March that is not the same as the cold of December or January. December cold is honest. It arrives with the season and announces itself, and a man can prepare for it because it is expected. March cold is different. It comes after the false hope of a February thaw, after the 2 warm days that make you believe the worst is behind you, and then it comes back harder than before, as though the brief warmth was a debt that the season has decided to collect with interest. On a Thursday morning in March of 1961, a man named Harold Goss stood on the loading dock of Goss Lumber and Supply on the edge of Cody and looked at the inventory he could not move, and the trucks he could not fill, and the yard that was emptier than it should have been, and the books that said what he already knew. He was 57 years old. His father had started the business in 1921. Harold had taken it over in 1949. He had been running it for 12 years. He was not going to be running it much longer. This is what happened. George Goss came to Wyoming from Minnesota in 1919 with a young wife, a set of tools, and the conviction, not uncommon in men of that era who had looked at a map and understood what the Western expansion still required, that the thing the country needed most was men who knew how to work with wood. He was not wrong. Cody in 1919 was a young town in the way that Wyoming towns were young then, which is to say it had enough of a foundation to suggest permanence, but not enough history to take permanence for granted. It needed buildings. It needed the framing and the planking and the finish work that buildings require. It needed a man who could supply the material and, when necessary, do the work himself. George Goss was that man. He built the business the way men built things then, without a business plan in the formal sense, but with a clear understanding of what was needed and who needed it and what a fair price for the service was. He bought a yard on the eastern edge of town when the eastern edge of town was far enough out that the price was low. He built a shed for the dry stock. He established accounts with the mills in Montana and Idaho and learned which ones cut clean and which ones cut fast, and priced the difference accordingly. By the mid-20s, the yard was the primary lumber supplier for a 100-mile radius. The Depression hit it, the way the Depression hit everything, which is to say hard. George Goss survived it the way certain businesses survive catastrophic downturns, by reducing everything to the minimum and working every day and refusing to close the doors even when the days went by without a customer. Because George Goss believed that the day you close the doors is the day you tell the town you are done, and he was not done. He was not done until 1949, when a stroke took him in his office at 61 years old, sitting at the same desk he had built himself in 1923 from good Douglas fir, which was still in the office when Harold sat at it 12 years later. Harold had grown up in the yard the way the sons of business owners grow up, absorbing the operation before they understand they are absorbing it, learning the wood and the accounts and the supplier relationships and the particular personality of every contractor and builder in a 100-mile radius who came through the gate. He took it over at 33 and ran it the way his father had run it, which is to say honestly, with a clear price and a reliable supply, and the understanding that a lumberyard's reputation is built one delivery at a time over decades and destroyed in a season if the quality slips or the word gets out that the price is not what it appears to be. He did not let the quality slip. He did not let the price deceive. The trouble, again, was not the operation. The trouble was the world moving underneath it. In the late 1950s, the large regional lumber chains began moving into Wyoming in the way large chains move into markets that have been held by independents, which is to say with better purchasing power and lower prices and the capacity to absorb losses in a given location long enough to outlast the competition. It was not illegal. It was not even from a certain angle unfair. It was the market doing what markets do, but what it did to Goss Lumber was specific and measurable. The large accounts, the contractors who had been coming to Harold's yard for a decade, began migrating to the chain yard that opened south of Cody in 1958. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough, and then more, and then the ones who stayed were the ones with loyalty that was personal rather than economic, and personal loyalty is not a sustainable business model because people retire and die and their successors have no personal connection to honor. Harold cut his margins. He renegotiated with his Montana mill. He let one employee go in 1959 and another in 1960, which left him with 2 men in the yard and the understanding that he was doing work that 3 men should be doing, and that this was not a solution but a delay. His wife, Margaret, did the books. Margaret had done the books since 1952, when it became clear that Harold's relationship with accounting was one of mutual distrust that was not improving with time. She was a precise woman, not cold, but precise, which is a different thing. She kept the ledger the way the ledger deserved to be kept, and she told Harold what the ledger said without softening it, because softening it would have been a kindness that produced a harm. In January of 1961, she told him what the ledger said. In March, she told him what it still said, which was the same thing, but more so. The bank in Cody held a note on the equipment, the truck fleet, 3 of which were past their useful life and had been kept running by Harold's mechanical stubbornness rather than any rational calculus. The note came due in April. The note was not coverable from current revenue, which had been declining for 2 years, or from reserves, which had been declining for longer. Harold stood on the loading dock on a Thursday morning in March and looked at the yard and did the arithmetic that Margaret's books had already done for him and arrived at the same answer. He had 6 weeks, possibly 8. And then Goss Lumber and Supply, which his father had opened in 1921 and kept open through a depression and a war and 12 subsequent years of steady, honest operation, would close. The yard would go to the bank. The equipment would go to auction. The accounts, what remained of them, would migrate to the chain yard south of town, and in 5 years nobody in Cody under 40 would remember there had been another option. He stood on the dock in the March cold. He was not a man given to displays of feeling, but he stood there a while. The truck that pulled into the yard at 10:30 was a pickup, dark blue New Mexico plates, which was an unusual origin for someone stopping at a lumber yard in Cody, Wyoming, in the middle of a Thursday morning. Harold noticed the plates from the dock. He came down off the dock and crossed the yard. The man who got out of the truck was large in the way that certain men are large, not as a statement but as a fact, the way a load-bearing wall is substantial without drawing attention to itself. He wore a canvas coat and a plain hat and boots with use on them, and he looked at the yard the way Harold had been looking at it himself all morning, taking inventory, reading what was there. He looked at the log deck on the north side, where the raw timber came in before it went to the saw. He looked at the dry shed. He looked at the truck fleet along the east fence, the 3 old ones and the 1 newer one. And he looked at them the way a man looks at machinery when he knows machinery, which is not at the surface but at the posture of it, the way the suspension sits, the way the tires carry the weight. He looked at Harold. "Help you?" Harold said. "Looking at framing lumber," the man said. "Doing some building?" "Where?" "Spread outside of Cody. Picked up the land last year. Putting up a barn and 2 outbuildings this spring." Harold nodded. This was legitimate business. A barn and 2 outbuildings was a meaningful order if the man was serious about it. "What dimensions?" Harold said. They talked lumber the way men who know lumber talk it, not with the vagueness of a man who has looked at a catalog and has a general idea, but with specificity. The man knew what he needed and why he needed it, and the difference between the grades and why the difference mattered for the application. Harold took him through the dry shed. He showed him the Douglas fir, which was what the man had asked for, and the man went over it the way the auctioneer Robert Pruitt had gone over the saddle fender, looking at the back side of things. The things you only look at when you know what you are looking at matters. He ran his hand along a piece of 16-foot 2x10. He looked at the end grain. "This is good stock," he said. "Montana mill," Harold said. "Same one my father used." "How long have you been here?" "I took it over in 49. My father started it in 21. The man looked around the shed. "You got competition now," he said. It was not a question. Harold looked at him. The chain yard south of town was not invisible. It had a sign visible from the highway and a price board out front that Harold's suppliers had mentioned to him in the context of their own negotiations with him about pricing. "I do," Harold said. "Doing all right?" And here it was again. The question asked plainly, by a man whose manner made the practiced deflection feel inadequate. Harold Goss was 57 years old and had been running this yard for 12 years and had kept his counsel on the state of the business to himself and Margaret and no one else in Cody, Wyoming, because the state of the business was nobody else's affair and because Harold Goss was built the way his father was built, which was to carry his own weight and not make his difficulties into other people's business. He looked at this man in his dry shed. A stranger, New Mexico plates, legitimate lumber order. "It's been a difficult stretch," Harold said. The man nodded. He picked up the end of the 16-foot 2x10 again. He looked at it. "How much timber do you have on hand right now?" he said. Harold told him. All of it, the man said. What would you take for all of it? Harold looked at him. All of it was not how lumber yards worked. Lumber yards sold by the board foot, by the order, by the job. They did not sell their entire dry stock inventory to a single buyer because that was not a thing that happened. You don't need all of it, Harold said. No, the man agreed. I need what I need for the barn and the outbuildings. What would you take for all of it? Harold ran the numbers in his head. He had been running numbers in his head for 2 months and they came fast. He said a number. The man looked at the stock on the shelves. That's too low, he said. Harold opened his mouth. Don't argue with me about it, the man said. I've looked at the stock. I know what it's worth. What you said is too low. He named a number. It was considerably above what Harold had said. Harold looked at him. You're not going to use all of it, Harold said. No, the man said. I'm going to buy all of it. Some of it I'll use. The rest I'll donate to the county building program. I know they're doing school construction out east of town. They can use the remainder. Harold Goss stood in his dry shed with his hands at his sides. He was not a man given to displays of feeling. He was having some feelings. That's not how you run a lumber purchase, he said. I'm not running a lumber purchase, the man said. I'm buying lumber. It's different. He looked at Harold steadily. You've got good stock and a 40-year reputation, and one competitor with lower prices and better buying power who has been here 3 years, he said. That's a solvable problem. It's not solved by selling all your timber inventory to one buyer, but it's not helped either. Harold said nothing. What do you need to cover April? The man said. Harold told him. This covers it, the man said. He was talking about the number he had named. Some, Harold said. More than some? Harold did the arithmetic. Yes, he said. More than some, then it's a start, the man said. You've still got a problem after April, but you've got April, and April is when you figure out May. He put out his hand. Do we have a deal? Harold Goss looked at this hand. He looked at the dry shed around him. He looked at the Montana fir stacked on the shelves, good stock, same mill his father used, the kind of material a man could stand behind, because the man behind the mill could stand behind it. He shook the hand. The paperwork took an hour. Margaret came down from the office when Harold called up to her, and she brought the invoice book and her reading glasses, and she sat at Harold's desk, the one made from Douglas fir in 1923, and wrote up the purchase order with the precision she brought to everything numerical. She did not react to the number when she wrote it. She wrote it correctly, which was the reaction she had decided on, because the number was large and correct numbers deserved to be written correctly. The man paid a deposit that afternoon in cash and arranged for the remainder on delivery, which he said would be coordinated with his building contractor, who would be in touch with Harold's yard the following week. He stood up from the desk. He looked around the office. He looked at the photograph on the wall, George Goss, 1930, standing in the yard with his hand on a load of timber, squinting into the sun. Your father? He said. Yes, Harold said. The man looked at the photograph for a moment. Good-looking yard, he said. Even then. He shook Harold's hand again. He shook Margaret's hand, which she had not expected and which she received with the composed directness she brought to unexpected things. He walked out through the office and across the yard and got into the dark blue truck with the New Mexico plates. He pulled out onto the road and turned west toward Cody. Margaret looked at Harold. Harold was looking at the desk. Well, Margaret said. Yes, Harold said. They were quiet for a moment. The county building program, Margaret said. He said he'd donate the remainder. He said that. Yes. Margaret looked at the invoice book. Who is he? She said. Harold had known for 40 minutes. He had known from the moment the man's manner had arranged itself into a recognizable shape, which had happened while they were looking at Engrain in the dry shed, and Harold's mind had placed a face he had seen on a movie poster on a man who knew how to read Engrain, and the combination had clicked into place with a quiet certainty. He had said nothing for the same reason that nobody in that county ever seemed to say anything when it happened. Because the man was not there to be recognized, he was there to buy lumber. Get your coat, Harold said. I'll tell you in the truck. The building contractor called on Wednesday. His name was Frank Aldis, which was a name Harold knew from the county, a reliable man who built things that stayed built, and Frank said he had an order from his client for the balance of the Goss lumber timber purchase, and he needed to arrange delivery starting the following week. Harold arranged it. Over the course of 2 weeks, the Goss yard delivered the bulk of its dry stock inventory to a spread outside Cody, where a barn and 2 outbuildings were going up, and the remainder, which was more than the remainder needed to be because the man had purchased more than he needed on purpose, was delivered to the county building office in Cody with a note that said it was donated for the school construction east of town and should be allocated at the building office's discretion. The building office allocated it. The school got its framing lumber at no cost, which freed up allocated funds for other materials, which accelerated the construction schedule, which meant the school opened in September instead of the following January. None of the people who sent their children to that school in the fall of 1961 knew any of this. They did not need to. April came. Harold covered the banknote. He covered it in full at the window, in person, the same window where the note had been originated, and where the woman behind it had processed a dozen similar notes for a dozen Cody businesses over the years, and understood without being told what it meant when a man came in ahead of the due date with the full amount. She stamped it. She gave him the receipt. He went back to the yard. He stood on the loading dock. The dock was emptier than it had been, because the stock had moved, which was the point. But the yard was still there. The sign above the gate that said Goss Lumber and Supply, EST. 1921 was still there. The dry shed was still there. The desk made of Douglas fir that his father had built in 1923 was still in the office where it had always been. And the problem was not solved. The man had said so himself. It was not solved. It was started. Harold stood on the dock and looked at what was still there and thought about the difference between started and solved, and about the fact that started was enough to work with. That started was what his father had had in 1921, and that started had become 40 years of a yard that the county depended on, and a desk made of good timber, and a reputation that was older than the chain yard south of town, and would still be there after the chain yard did whatever chain yards did when the economics shifted and they moved on to the next market. He was 57 years old. He had work to do. He went inside. He did not close in 1961. He did not close in 1962 or 1963. What the lumber purchase had bought was not just April. It had bought the time to make the adjustments that the pressure of imminent failure had been preventing him from making clearly. He renegotiated with the Montana mill again, this time from a position that was not desperation, and came away with terms that were genuinely better. He dropped 2 of the old trucks, the ones his mechanical stubbornness had been keeping alive past their rational life, and used the savings to bring in a younger man who knew diesel engines and could maintain the remaining fleet at a cost that made sense. He called on every contractor in a 100-mile radius personally, which was something his father had done and that Harold had done early in his tenure and had stopped doing as the business settled, and which he recognized, in the March cold on the loading dock, he should not have stopped doing. He did not win all of them back. He won enough of them. The chain yard south of town had lower prices on standard stock. Harold could not beat the price. He stopped trying to beat the price and started beating the service, the knowledge, the willingness to solve a problem that a catalog and a price board could not solve, the specific thing that a 40-year-old independent with a relationship with every mill in Montana had over an operation that was one of 30 yards in a regional chain and was managed accordingly. It took 2 years. By 1963, the book said something different from what they had said in January of 1961. Not prosperous. Harold Goss was not going to be prosperous, but stable, sustainable. The kind of business that a man can look at in March and not feel the ground moving underneath it. Margaret said so, which was the relevant benchmark. His son came into the business in 1967. David Goss was 24 years old and had a degree in business from the University of Wyoming, and opinions about modernization that Harold received with approximately the same patience that Robert Cole had received Daniel's opinions about the coffee machine, which is to say with the patience of a man who knows the opinions are not wrong but has some thoughts about the sequence. They argued for 2 years. After 2 years they agreed, which is the natural outcome when both people in an argument are right about different parts of the problem. David modernized the accounting. He updated the truck fleet. He brought in a product line that his father had not carried, engineered lumber and composite materials, that the contractors were asking for increasingly, and that the chain yard carried as a matter of course. Harold kept the Montana mill relationship. He kept the personal contractor calls. He kept the Douglas fir. Between the two of them, the yard ran for another 22 years. Harold Goss died in 1984 at 80 years old. which was 23 years longer than the loading dock in March of 1961 had suggested he would have. He died in the office, at the desk, the one his father built in 1923 from good Douglas fir. David kept the yard running until 1996. When he finally closed it, it was not because the business failed. It was because David was 63 and his own son had gone a different direction, and there was no one to hand it to, and David had the sense to recognize that a business handed to someone who did not want it was not a gift, but a burden, and that closing with dignity was not the same as failing. He did not sell the desk. He took it home. It is there now in a house in Cody, Wyoming, in a room that David uses as an office. On the desk, there is a framed receipt. It is the bank receipt from April of 1961, the note stamped paid. David found it in the files when he was clearing the office in 1996 and understood immediately what it was and why it had been kept and framed it himself. There is no explanation below it, no card, no note about what it records, just the receipt, stamped paid. April 1961. The man never mentioned a lumber yard in Cody. Not to the press, not in any interview, not in any account that has been found. He went back to his spread and his barn went up that spring, framed in Montana Douglas fir from a 40-year-old yard on the eastern edge of Cody, and the barn stood the way things stand when they are built right, and it is still standing. The school east of Cody opened in September of 1961. The children who went to school there in 1961 are in their 70s now. They do not know about the lumber. They know about the school. That is the right distribution. One dark blue truck with New Mexico plates, one dry shed, one number named too low and corrected by the man who heard it. April covered, and then, from April, the work of building May and June, and the year after that, and the 22 years after that, which produced a yard that outlasted its worst moment by 3.5 decades and a desk made of Douglas fir that is in a house in Cody right now, holding the weight of whatever is on it, the way a thing holds weight when it was built to hold weight. That is what a started looks like when the man it is given to knows what to do with a started. George Goss knew. Harold Goss knew. The man who drove the dark blue truck and read end grain in a Montana fir shed and understood that too low was too low knew that they knew. He bought their lumber. He pointed them toward April. They found May themselves. If this one found you, pass it on. Share it with someone who is looking at April right now and cannot quite see May. Subscribe if you haven't yet. More Duke stories coming.